All right, so let's dive into some international news, shall we?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we're heading over to Munich, Germany.
Okay.
It's February 14th, 2025. It's the Munich Security Conference. Can you picture it?
Yeah, snowy Munich. I can see it.
And in this snowy backdrop, we've got Vice President J.D. Vance
All right.
delivering a keynote address.
Big stage.
But this is not your typical diplomatic kind of speech. Vance, he goes straight for some controversial topics, and he challenges the status quo and really kind of shakes things up. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of dive into the core of his argument and what it means for the future of democracy. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most striking things about Vance's address is how he sort of redefines what the biggest threat to Europe is.
Okay.
You know, he doesn't point to Russia or China, but to internal threats, a decline in fundamental values within Europe itself. And he highlights specific examples to kind of back up this claim.
Oh, really? Like what?
So he mentions, for example, a European commissioner just casually endorsing the potential cancellation of elections in Romania.
Wow.
And also police raids in Germany targeting people for online comments that are deemed anti-feminist.
That's pretty intense. So he's using these examples to paint a picture of a decline in democratic values.
Exactly.
As the biggest threat.
And he goes on to argue that, these examples point to a broader trend, the decline of free speech in the West. He really uses some strong imagery, paints a picture of freedom of speech under fire.
Oh, wow.
And he points to several specific instances.
Okay.
One example he uses is the EU's intention to control social media during times of unrest.
Okay.
He brings up a Swedish court that convicted a Christian activist for participating in Quran burnings. And then he brings up the UK's buffer zones law that criminalizes silent prayer near abortion clinics.
Yeah, I remember reading about that was pretty controversial.
And he even goes as far as to mention letters from the Scottish government warning citizens that praying in their own homes could be illegal.
Are we at a point where the government's telling us what we can and cannot pray about in our own homes?
Well, that seems to be the question that Vance is listing. Where do we draw the line?
Right.
He sees these examples, particularly in Europe, as a dangerous slide towards censorship and suppression of dissenting voices, even if those voices are expressing views that might be unpopular or controversial.
Okay, so he's making this case against Europe, but he's not letting the U.S. off the hook, is he?
No, he's not. He does acknowledge America's own issues with censorship.
Okay.
He specifically references the previous administration's pressure on social media companies to censor certain viewpoints, including the lab leak theory about the origins of COVID-19.
So he's contrasting how the U.S. has handled censorship with how Europe is handling censorship.
Yeah, and he's drawing a distinction between that approach and what he sees as the Trump administration's commitment to defending free speech.
Oh, okay.
Even when they disagree with the views being expressed.
So it sounds like he's saying that, a healthy democracy require this kind of engagement and dialogue, even with those we disagree with.
Exactly.
But that does it a tough question, though, doesn't it? Is that always possible? What about genuinely harmful ideologies?
Yeah, that's right. It's that classic question of, where's the line? When does engaging in dialogue become enabling those harmful ideologies?
Right.
And it's a challenge that Vance kind of lays out there. How do we find that balance?
Right.
How do we ensure open dialogue while also guarding against, giving a platform to dangerous or harmful ideas?
Interesting. So he's really bringing up some pretty fundamental questions here about the nature of democracy and free speech.
Yeah, he really is. And then he kind of shifts gears a little bit and tackles a topic that's been incredibly contentious in recent years, mass migration. Vance straight up calls it one of the most pressing challenges facing the nations that are represented at this conference.
Okay.
And he's not afraid to use numbers to kind of drive home his point. He points out that immigration has reached all-time highs in both the EU and the US.
Okay.
And to bring this concern to the forefront even more, he references the recent attack in Munich as a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of uncontrolled immigration.
Yeah, that's a sensitive topic for sure. But he doesn't give specifics about the attacker's background, so it's hard to assess, the direct connection he's making between the attack and immigration.
That's right. But what he does emphasize is the importance of listening to people's concerns about immigration, even when those concerns might be unpopular or controversial. He seems to be urging leaders not to dismiss or ignore those anxieties.
Even when they might stem from misinformation or prejudice.
Exactly.
It's about acknowledging the concerns of the people, even if they're uncomfortable.
That's right.
So it sounds like Vance's overall message is urging leaders to face these issues head on, to engage in open and honest dialogue, even on the tough topics.
Yes.
He sees that as crucial for a healthy democracy.
Yeah.
But his approach, particularly on immigration, definitely raises questions about how we balance those concerns with protecting vulnerable groups.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah, and Vance's speech is a stark reminder that navigating these complex issues requires careful consideration and a willingness to have those uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, he's definitely not shying away from controversy, that's for sure.
Definitely not.
All right, well, this has been a really fascinating look at J.D. Vance's keynote address. Okay, so we've unpacked a lot of Vance's arguments.
Yeah.
But it sounds like this speech didn't exactly go over super well with everyone. So what were the reactions like?
You could say that. Vance's speech sparked a lot of controversy and debate both in Europe and back home in the U.S. It definitely didn't go unnoticed.
I can imagine a high-profile speech like that addressing such sensitive topics.
Right.
Bound to generate some strong reaction.
For sure.
So what were some of the immediate responses?
Well, right there at the Munich Security Conference,
okay,
several attendees, particularly those from European countries, voiced their disagreement with how Vance characterized Europe's commitment to democratic values.
Oh, wow.
Some even found her remarks insulting.
So it really touched a nerve.
Definitely.
Did anyone accuse him of hypocrisy? Especially given America's own struggles with political polarization and issues like racial injustice?
Absolutely. That was a common critique, particularly from European leaders and commentators who saw a disconnect between Vance's critique of Europe and the U.S.'s own internal challenges.
Interesting. So pushback from Europe, but how did the speech land back home in the U.S.?
It seemed to resonate more strongly with certain segments of the American public. Conservative media outlets in particular were largely supportive of Vance's message.
Okay.
They framed it as a bold defense of free speech and a challenge to what they perceived as European elitism.
So it tapped into a kind of pre-existing narrative then, the idea of America standing as a beacon of free speech against a supposedly censorious Europe.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the media. Vance's words seemed to tap into a sense of frustration among some Americans who feel that their values are being ignored or undermined by those in power.
Yeah, I can see how that message emphasizing the importance of free speech and traditional values could appeal to a certain audience.
Yeah.
Particularly those who feel disillusioned with the current political landscape.
That's right. And whether intentional or not, Vance's speech seems to feed into this broader narrative of a clash of values between the U.S. and Europe.
Right. It's like he's drawing a line in the sand and saying, look, we might have our problems, but at least we're still standing up for free speech and the right to disagree.
Yes, and while that message might resonate with some, it also oversimplifies a very complex issue.
Right.
It reduces it to this us versus them dynamic.
Yeah.
Which ignores the fact that both the U.S. and Europe are facing similar challenges.
Okay.
When it comes to issues like online misinformation, political extremism, and the rise of authoritarianism.
So it's not as simple as saying, one side is good and the other is bad.
Definitely not.
Both sides have their own set of challenges and complexities when it comes to upholding those democratic values. What about the reaction on social media?
Oh, social media was a hotbed of discussion and debate after Vance's speech. Hashtags like #VanceInMunich and #European started trending almost immediately, with people from all over the world weighing in on his arguments.
I bet. It might have been quite the free-for-all.
Yeah, you had people passionately defending or condemning Vance's message.
Did any particular theme or sentiment stand out in all that online discourse?
Well, you have to remember that social media often amplifies the most extreme voices.
Right.
So it's not always a reliable gauge of public opinion.
Okay.
While there was a lot of buzz online, it's hard to say how representative those reactions were of broader public sentiment.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in those echo chambers of social media.
Exactly.
Where the loudest voices tend to dominate the conversation, even if they don't represent the majority view.
Right. But regardless of how one feels about Vance's message, there's no denying that he ignited a conversation about the state of democracy in the 21st century. And that in itself is a valuable contribution.
So it's less about whether he's right or wrong and more about his speech acting as a catalyst for a broader discussion.
Yes, I think so. Vance forced people to confront some uncomfortable truths about the challenges facing democracies around the world.
Okay.
He challenged us to examine our own values and to consider how we can better defend the principles of free speech,
Right.
open dialogue, and respect for diverse opinions.
That's a good point. Even if we disagree with his approach or his conclusions,
right,
his speech at least got people talking.
For sure.
And thinking about these crucial issues. But let's delve a bit deeper into some of the specifics he raised. His comments about immigration in particular seemed to generate a lot of controversy.
Yeah, his argument about mass migration posing a serious threat to European security drew significant criticism.
Okay.
While carefully worded, his rhetoric echoed some of the talking points used by far-right populist movements that have gained traction in Europe and elsewhere.
I could see how that would raise red flags. These movements often exploit anxieties about immigration.
Exactly.
Linking it to crime, terrorism, and a perceived loss of national identity.
And that kind of rhetoric framing immigration primarily as a security threat can lead to discriminatory policies and a climate of fear and intolerance.
So while there might be legitimate concerns about the need to manage immigration effectively and address security risks, Vance's framing of the issue, without acknowledging those complexities, could be seen as feeding into these harmful narratives.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance. You need to address those legitimate concerns without resorting to fear-mongering or scapegoating.
Right.
And that requires a nuanced and compassionate approach that recognizes the complex factors that drive migration and the contributions that immigrants make to their adopted countries.
It's about looking at the whole picture.
Yes.
Considering all the factors at play.
For sure.
And avoiding generalizations or simplistic solutions.
Exactly. And that nuanced perspective seemed to be missing from Vance's argument. He focused on the potential risks without fully acknowledging the complexities and benefits of immigration.
So moving on from immigration, another key theme in Vance's speech was the perceived decline of free speech in the West.
Right.
He cited a range of examples from social media censorship to the prosecution of individuals for expressing controversial views.
Yes, and Lavin went so far as to suggest that some European countries are engaging in thought crime by criminalizing activities like silent prayer near abortion clinics.
That's a pretty strong accusation. Did he offer any evidence or context to support that claim?
This is where Vance's argument becomes more problematic. While there are legitimate concerns about the erosion of free speech in certain contexts, his examples are often cherry-picked and taken out of context.
So he's highlighting specific incidents without necessarily presenting the full picture.
Exactly.
Or acknowledging the broader context in which those incidents occurred.
Exactly. And he also fails to acknowledge the important role that government regulation can sometimes play in protecting vulnerable groups from hate speech, harassment, and incitement to violence.
So it's about finding that balance again, right? Protecting free speech while also recognizing that there are limits when it comes to speech that can incite harm or violence.
Precisely. It's a delicate balancing act. Democracies need to find ways to protect free speech while also safeguarding against its potential harms. And Vance's simplistic framing of the issue doesn't really advance that conversation.
It sounds like he's presenting a very black and white view of a complex issue.
Yes, and that can be problematic because it oversimplifies the debate and makes it harder to find nuanced solutions.
Okay, so we've explored some of the reactions to Vance's speech and delved a bit deeper into his arguments about immigration and free speech. What about the bigger picture? How does all of this fit into the broader context of global politics?
What's striking about Vance's speech is how it reflects a growing trend of transatlantic tension and a divergence in values between the U.S. and Europe. This isn't entirely new, but Vance's remarks seem to signal a hardening of these divisions.
It's like we're seeing a widening gap in how we understand and approach fundamental issues like democracy, freedom, and the role of government.
Exactly. And that gap has the potential to create significant challenges for transatlantic cooperation on a range of issues, from security and trade to climate change and global health.
So this speech could exacerbate existing tensions.
Yes.
And make it harder for the U.S. and Europe to work together on these shared challenges.
That's a real concern. If we're constantly emphasizing our differences and viewing each other through a lens of suspicion, it becomes much harder to find common ground and work together effectively.
It sounds like we need to be careful not to let these differences escalate into outright hostility.
Yes.
Or undermine the foundations of transatlantic cooperation.
Definitely.
What role do you think the rise of populism plays in all of this?
Vance's speech also highlights the increasing influence of populist movements on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay.
These movements often share a disdain for traditional institutions, a skepticism of expertise, and a tendency to frame complex issues in simplistic, emotionally charged terms.
And while those movements can sometimes serve as a corrective to political complacency and elitism, they can also erode democratic norms, exacerbate social divisions, and undermine trust in institutions.
Exactly. They often tap into legitimate grievances, but offer simplistic solutions that may not address the underlying problems.
Vance's speech, with its focus on cultural anxieties and its appeal to a sense of grievance, seems to tap into this populist current. It's a message that resonates with those who feel left behind by globalization, ignored by elites, and threatened by rapid social and cultural change.
That's a key insight. His speech resonated with a specific audience precisely because it addressed these anxieties and offered a seemingly straightforward explanation for complex problems.
So it's not just about the content of his arguments, but also about the way he frames those arguments.
Exactly.
And the audience he's trying to reach.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to engage with these anxieties, to understand their root causes. And to find ways to address them without resorting to divisive rhetoric or simplistic solutions.
We need to move beyond the blame game.
Yes.
And the us versus them mentality and focus on finding common ground and building bridges.
Exactly. We need to have a nuanced and informed conversation about the challenges facing democracies around the world. We need to find ways to bridge the transatlantic divide and strengthen the bonds of shared values and common purpose.
That's a tall order.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to bridge that divide when there seems to be such a fundamental difference in perspectives and values?
It's not going to be easy. That's for sure. It requires leadership, vision, and a commitment to open dialogue and mutual understanding. It requires a willingness to listen to each other, to understand where our differences come from, and to find ways to work together despite those differences.
So it's about finding that common ground even when it feels like we're worlds apart.
Yes.
Do you think Vance's speech contributed anything positive to that effort?
While Vance's speech might have raised more questions than it answered, it served as a powerful reminder of the fragility of democracy and the need for constant vigilance in defense of our shared values.
It's a wake-up call, then.
Yeah.
A reminder that we can't take our freedoms for granted. And that democracy requires constant work and engagement.
Exactly. It's a call to action, a challenge to engage in the difficult but necessary work of building a more just, inclusive, and democratic world. And that's something we can all agree on, regardless of our political affiliations or national identities.
Wow. So we really dissected Vance's speech,
the
reactions to it, and how it fits into this bigger picture of global politics. It's a lot to process.
It is.
What does it all mean for us? You know, the average person just trying to make sense of this increasingly complex world.
That's the question, isn't it? You know, I don't have all the answers.
Sure.
But I do think there are a few key takeaways from this deep dive that might help us navigate these kind of turbulent times we're in.
Okay, I'm all ears. What stands out to you as the most important things to remember?
Well, first, it's crucial to remember that these challenges to democracy aren't isolated to one country or region. The issues that Vance brought up, you know, free speech, immigration, the erosion of trust in institutions, they're playing out on a global scale.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in that us versus them mentality.
Exactly.
But these are shared struggles that we're all facing in different ways.
That's right. And that shared struggle can actually be a starting point for collaboration and finding solutions together. Instead of pointing fingers and building walls, we need to focus on learning from each other, sharing best practices, and working together to strengthen democratic institutions across the board.
Yeah, it makes you think about the interconnectedness of it all.
Yes.
If democracy is strengthened globally, we all benefit in the long run.
Absolutely. The second key takeaway is the importance of critical thinking. We're bombarded with information from all sides these days. And it can be incredibly difficult to sift through all the noise and determine what's true, what's biased, and what's outright manipulation.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming at times, like trying to drink from a fire hose. How do we even begin to develop those those critical thinking skills?
It starts with questioning our assumptions and being willing to consider multiple perspectives.
Okay.
We need to be wary of information that simply confirms our existing biases.
Right.
And we need to seek out diverse viewpoints to get a more complete picture.
So it's not just about consuming information,
right,
but actively engaging with it.
Exactly.
Analyzing it and forming our own informed opinions.
Precisely. And this applies not just to the news we consume, but also to the opinions we encounter, even those from our elected officials.
So even if we might agree with someone like J.D. Vance, we shouldn't just take his words at face value.
Exactly. It's about engaging critically with his arguments, considering the evidence he presents, and weighing his perspective against other viewpoints.
We need to become our own fact checkers and critical thinkers in this age of information overload. It's a lot of responsibility.
It is, but it's essential for navigating the complexities of the world today. And that brings me to the final takeaway, which is about maintaining hope and agency. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these challenges, to feel like the problems are just too big and complex for any one person to make a difference.
Oh, I definitely feel that sometimes. Like, what can I possibly do to change things?
But here's the thing. Democracy thrives on participation.
Okay.
It's not a spectator sport. It requires each of us to be engaged, to hold our leaders accountable, and to work together to shape a better future.
So even small actions can make a difference, like voting in local elections.
Absolutely.
Or contacting our representatives or getting involved in community organizations.
Every voice matters. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to the collective effort to strengthen democracy.
That's actually pretty empowering.
It is.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges.
Right.
We have the ability to shape the world around us.
Precisely. And that sense of agency, that belief in our collective power to create positive change, is essential to counteract the cynicism and despair that can feel so pervasive in these uncertain times.
Okay, so global collaboration, critical thinking, and active participation are key. Is there anything else we can do to ensure that democracy not only survives but thrives in this rapidly changing world?
This is where I'd like to leave you with a final thought-provoking idea. What if, instead of just defending existing democratic systems, we started thinking more radically about what democracy could look like in the 21st century?
Now you've got my attention. What do you mean by thinking more radically?
Imagine a world where technology is used not to control or manipulate, but to empower citizens and facilitate more direct and participatory forms of democracy. Imagine systems where citizens have a more direct say in the decisions that affect their lives, where their voices are truly heard and acted upon.
That's a bold vision. It almost sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
It might sound futuristic, but these are ideas worth exploring. If we truly value democracy, we can't simply be content with the status quo. We need to be constantly evolving, adapting, and innovating to ensure that our systems reflect the needs and aspirations of the people they are meant to serve.
So democracy isn't a static concept.
No.
It's a living, breathing thing that needs to evolve to meet the challenges of our time.
Exactly. And that evolution requires imagination, creativity, and a willingness to challenge conventional thinking.
Well, that's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into J.D. Vance's speech and its broader implications. It's been a journey through global politics.
It is.
Thorny issues and thought-provoking insights.
We've explored reactions, dissected arguments, and hopefully sparked some new ideas about the future of democracy. It's not just about what's happening on the world stage, but about how we as individuals engage with these issues and contribute to shaping a better future.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even felt a spark of hope for the future of democracy.
And if you're hungry for more deep dives into fascinating topics, be sure to subscribe to our podcast available on Spotify, other podcasts, and YouTube.